What to do when your enemies just won't cooperate with you. We look at joint multinational operations in the Malaya Campaign. We're looking at economy of effort and cooperation as they applied to the Malaya Campaign. So, first off, economy of effort. Economy of effort is the prudent allocation and application of resources to achieve the desired results and needs to be balanced with the other principles of war, notably security and sustainment. For example, the more resources allocated to ensuring security, the fewer are available for offensive action. Economy of effort is required to achieve, maintain, or switch the main effort elsewhere. Supporting efforts are designed to contribute to the achievement of the main effort and subsequent mission success. So there you have it. That is straight out of LWD-1, the Australian doctrine. Now, the interesting thing about Malaya is that for both of the opposing forces, this was an effort that was a long way down the priority list, both for the Japanese and for the Allies. So they were on the receiving end of the economy of effort principle in the allocation of forces that they received. The most glaring example of this, of course, is the British. There was far too much economy and not enough effort. And I think this really starts with the whole of government approach in Singapore. So the governor there, Governor Shenton Thomas, he had a mandate to continue the production of tin and rubber for the Allied war effort. That was his main effort. Now, that flowed through into a couple of really interesting consequences for the defenders. The first one was that there was no labour for defensive works. This is part of the reason why the defensive positions were in such a parlous state when the Japanese actually invaded. The defending forces were left with the dilemma of what were they going to spend their time on? Were they going to be developing their defensive positions, or were they going to be out training? Now, obviously, the imperative should have been around training, and that was shown by the level of morale, the level of performance that the troops were putting in after the first contact with the Japanese. But a lot of the time that they were spending had to have been spent on developing the defensive positions because they just couldn't get the labour that they needed to be able to do this. There's very little training value in digging a hole. You dig a hole once, you kind of know how to dig a hole. That's the end of the training component of digging a hole. When you're defending an entire country, as the Allies were, there's a lot of holes that need to be dug. And it really makes sense to be able to allocate that to a civilian workforce. Employ them, get them to dig the holes, and your troops can be then out in the jungle, training, rehearsing, developing doctrine even. This is how parlous the preparations were. There was a lot of them who didn't have the doctrine that they required. All of these things could have been done. Instead, a lot of the troops were splitting their time between training and developing defensive positions. Now, there was also a restriction on the amount of defensive works that could be done because it would have been bad for morale. So for some reason, all of this defensive work was viewed to be not in the best interests of the morale of the general population. And this goes back to I think, the moral element of the Malaya and Singapore area, and that is where you've got a civilian population that is at odds with what it is that you're trying to achieve. So when we spoke about the human terrain, obviously the Chinese had a vested interest in a successful defence of Malaya and Singapore. The Malay people, significantly less so. Same with the Indian expats, a lot of whom were working in the tin and rubber operations. So there was a desire not to upset morale too much. This meant that defensive works were significantly decreased. Not only of that, you can see that the economy of effort really did apply to the amount of troops that had been allocated all the way through from the top. The grand strategic component to the strategy was that the Royal Navy was going to occupy a base. That was never going to happen because the main effort was the defence of the homeland. The RAF, they were going to build a whole heap of bases. They built a whole heap of bases, and we're going to talk a little bit more later in the podcast about all of their bases, but they didn't have the planes for the bases, and they didn't have the pilots for the bases. So initially they had some really good fighter pilots who had Battle of Britain experience, they were rotated out as the needs of the war grew more dire, and so untrained pilots were left. And lastly, of course, the actual number of troops. The number of troops was insufficient to be able to mount a coherent defence of the entire Malaya landmass as well as Singapore. Now, why was this? Well, I think that there was an element of the willing surprisee. It would have been a complete disaster if Malaya had been invaded, so let's just pretend that it's not going to happen. Let's not prepare for it. The strategy of hoping, and hope isn't a task verb, so should never be used, particularly when you're speaking at strategic level, but they were hoping that the United States would be able to deter Japanese aggression and that they would be able to come to the aid of Singapore. And I guess this is one of those things where they hadn't really thought through the options for the Japanese. So the Japanese could obviously invade Malaya to get to Singapore. That bit was thought out. But in the wider picture, it was highly likely that the Americans would come to the assistance of the British, which would mean that the US Pacific Fleet would be there able to defend Singapore and Malaya. Probably. The degree of support that the Allies could expect from the Americans, that was still undecided, and there's an excellent documentary on Netflix called Five Came Back, and that talks about the mobilisation of Hollywood towards the war effort. And in that, there is a speech by Charles Lindbergh, and he is saying that the United States shouldn't intervene in a war that didn't directly affect them. So you can see how this whole strategy was founded on assumptions that may or may not have been correct. Now, when you look at the Japanese decision-making, of course, their decision to attack Pearl Harbor severely limits their ability to influence operations in the Pacific in the short term, which means that the economy of effort that is applied is sufficient as long as the Japanese are able to secure Malaya and Singapore quickly enough. The problem was that the decision to reinforce Singapore was taken too late. So immediately after the strike at Pearl Harbor and the invasion of Malaya, the British 18th Division is diverted, but they don't arrive into Singapore until the 13th of January. Now, they'd had no training, they'd had 13 weeks at sea, and none of their equipment came with them. That was coming in a subsequent convoy. So all of their training had been around desert operations. So it took them a significant amount of time to be ready, and their influence on the defence of Malaya and Singapore was not significant, unfortunately. Further Indian brigades were sent, 99 Hurricanes were sent, 58 Blenheims and 52 Hudsons. None of this was enough to be able to blunt the Japanese offensive action. And this is where too much economy of effort has created a reinforcement cycle that is too long to be able to hold out for before the Japanese are able to subjugate the Malaya and Singapore. From a Japanese point of view, so once again, a secondary effort of a secondary effort. I think one of the really big things with this is that Yamashita is assigned 4 divisions, so the 5th Infantry, 18th Infantry Divisions, the Imperial Guards Division, and the 56th Infantry Division. Now, we haven't mentioned the 56th Infantry Division, and that was because Yamashita decided to leave it in Taiwan. He left it as the Theatre Reserve. This is an amazing insight into the planning that went ahead. So he had to operate incredibly quickly. So speed was of the essence. Otherwise, Malaya and Singapore would have been reinforced to the point that they couldn't be taken. But he knew that if he took too many troops with him, he'd have too many mouths to feed, his logistics tail would be too unwieldy, and he wouldn't be able to achieve his mission. But I think it's really interesting, and you can imagine if you were on an exercise and you left a quarter of your troops behind and said, well, I'm not going to use them, I'm going to have them as the theatre reserve, that would be quite colourful. This is what he did, and I think this is part of the genius that he had when he was planning his campaign. Now, on to cooperation. So, cooperation within joint combined arms interagency teams, allies and coalition partners is vital for success. Only in this way can the resources and energies of each be harnessed so as to achieve success. Synchronization and orchestration are implicit in cooperation. the principle of cooperation is fundamental to combined arms teams. So let's have a look as we sort of break it down, because one can't help but feel that the issues of cooperation between the Allies were fundamental to the reasons why the wheels fell off the wagon here. And straight up, I think it's really important to highlight the fact that it is every commander's job to work towards cooperation. Cooperation between all of the moving parts of the whole of government approach to achievement of the mission, but also on an interpersonal level. This is where a lot of these problems came, was at an interpersonal level. People who just aren't good people. And I think the higher up the hierarchy you go, the more you need to be focusing on developing harmonious relationships with your partners. Because when that doesn't happen, then it's very difficult to achieve this cooperation. And we find in Malaya that there was very little cooperation between the Navy, Air Force and Army. There was very little cooperation between the British, the Australians and some of the Indian units. There was very poor use of LOs, liaison officers. Now, some of this comes from the poor selection and maintenance of the aim. So we keep going back to this, but I think it is the fundamental problem. The RAF, it was part of its struggle for survival and relevance, was arguing for a strategic role in Malaya. Now, unfortunately, the elements that were assigned to Malaya, a lot of them were from Coastal Command, and that was placed below Bomber and Fighter Command in priority. This is one of the reasons why there was an issue with pilot training in Malaya. The torpedo bomber squadrons that were a part of Coastal Command, that they had the Shark, the Albacore, and the Wildebeest. Now, the Wildebeest was so obsolete that it's not even listed in Jane's aircraft of World War II. Now, it's a bit of a tragedy that these aircraft are so antiquated and that they're a huge aircraft, a huge biplane, and they really do look like a sleek aircraft from 1918. Although actually their first flight was in 1928. But it does look like something that would have been a lot more at home in World War I rather than in World War II. Now, in 1936, the RAF began a program to build bases on the mainland. Now, the interesting thing about this is that they didn't consult the Army as to where those bases should be built. So, and a part of this, I think, is the struggle between the services to work out which one's going to have supremacy in the defence of Malaya. Now, the interesting thing is the Navy didn't want it. The Army really didn't want it. It was only the Air Force who was kind of putting their hands up to be able to fulfil that role. But you've also got to think of it from the tri-service approach where the funds allocated, remembering that we're still thinking pre-war here, the funds that are allocated, if more money goes to Air Force or Navy, then that's obviously less for Army. So that you get this interesting tri-service kind of conflict that has flowed through into operational thinking, which is where this lack of consultation between the services comes from. And I think that is then overlaid on interpersonal issues between the service chiefs in Malaya Command. And it's interesting, they say that Major General William Dobby, he was the GIC of Malaya Command, he only found out about the air bases after close questioning of his RAF subordinates. Now, he was concerned that the bases were spread out, difficult to defend, and that their capture would allow the rapid advance of Japanese air units. Not a lot of thinking had been put into where these bases were going to be built. Now, why is that? So, well, I think that they didn't look to leverage the expertise of the Army in regard to that, and also potentially because the doctrine of airfield defence probably hadn't been fully developed. Remembering that the Air Force had been operating behind static lines for a significant amount of time. So potentially, there was not a lot of doctrine to rely upon when you were trying to think about where is it, what are the considerations for where you would put an airbase. And I tried to find some, and the only real thinking that I could find about it was, well, we want to be as close to the sea because the closer to the sea means more time out over the sea as we bomb the Japanese transport as they're coming in to land their troops. That was all I could really find out. Now, in 1938, this was before it had been decided that the RAF was going to have primacy. Air Vice Marshal John Babington, he argued that without the fleet, the role must go to the Air Force. And there was a significant disagreement between Babington and Bond, who was the commander of the Far East Command. And so it was referred to the Chiefs of Staff. They failed to provide direction. They agreed that the Army and Air Force needed to be stronger, that the Army must defend all of Malaya. They reiterated the mission to retain the base, but again reiterated that it could not promise to send the fleet. So Malaya Command replied with a plan that focused on the Air Force being relied upon to cripple the invading force at sea, and the Army must conform with those plans. Now, this is after the air bases have been built. So relations between Bond and Babington deteriorated to the point where they weren't on speaking terms. Wow. Now, Malaya desperately needed reinforcements, but instead they got a new Commander-in-Chief Far East Command, which was Brooke Popham. He replaced the service chiefs with a new Air Vice Marshal, which was Conway Pulford, who took command of RAF Far East, and Lieutenant General Percival took over command of Malaya Command. Pulford and Percival restored relations between the Army and the Air Force. But in reality, I think a lot of the damage had been done. Interestingly, Brooke Popham was the first Air Force commander of a joint theatre headquarters. Now, so we're left with a situation where you've got Brooke Popham, and he was a retired RAF Air Chief Marshal with a reputation for patience and conciliation, being responsible for the defence of a base for the Navy, which did not report to him, but they were meant to provide him with intelligence. And he was responsible for coordinating two services that were not speaking with each other, and both of whom were required to defend a naval base that the Navy had no intentions of using. So it's all a little bit mixed up, isn't it? And on the sidelines, you've got countries like Australia looking on thinking, well, we hope that the defence of Singapore is going swimmingly because we've hung our hat on that defence. Now, Malaya Command issued out some information to the brigades, and it said that in view of the increasing strength of the RAF in Malaya, and to the extent of disorganisation which air attack may be expected to inflict on an attempt to effect a landing on an open beach, the policy of the defence of the East Coast in general has been modified. The enemy will be defeated on the Mersing beaches. Any who land will be killed or driven into the sea. So let's just have a look at that. Any who land. So now this implies that the RAF is going to destroy the entire fleet as it is trying to insert onto the beaches. The RAF never said they had that capability. It still didn't have the strength to be able to do this, and it also meant that now going to be no depth on the beaches, and there was going to be no provision of a reserve. In late 1941, Pulford deployed units to 9 of the 11 air bases in Malaya, and they recognised that they had badly miscalculated the requirement for defence of these air bases, but they continued on with it anyway. Now, one of the great things about the defence is that in general, you're going to get to pick the ground on which you fight. This is one of the reasons why, doctrinally, you go with a 3-to-1 ratio when you're attacking, because the enemy will have chosen some choice ground, and they are shaping you to conform with their plan, and that is going to make it costly. So when you have the ground that you're going to defend dictated to you, rather than you selecting the ground based on the principles of the defence, when it is dictated to you, this is one of the things that starts to make the defence more difficult. And so Percival, rather than being able to pick the ground of his choosing, is given ground that is required to be held so that they can defend the air bases along with the approaches to those air bases. And I think in some respects this creates a turbulent environment. No one has thought about logistics, no one's thought about withdrawal routes, no one's thought about the approaches to these areas. So the situation is getting quite turbulent, and we haven't even factored the enemy into the situation yet. So this is the situation from an inter-service cooperation point of view, or more accurately, an inter-service rivalry point of view, which is really quite an issue. But what about when we get into intra-service cooperation? So what was it like between the corps? How was cooperation there? And I think it's a really good opportunity to look at some of the work that the engineers were doing. In particular, Brigadier Ivan Simpson. So Simpson was sent out evidently to be Percival's chief royal engineer. Now, there's a couple of interesting things. His orders were to be confirmed by the SIGs, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff. He arrived without any papers. He attempted to get his orders confirmed. There was no response to that. And there was nothing forwarded from the SIGs. So he really had no authority, and Percival never really worked to clarify his position. Apart from that, he was incredibly industrious. There's no one who said that he didn't work very diligently. He found the state of defences to be quite parlous. He scouted the country and came up with a very comprehensive plan of defensive works that needed to be done. He planned defensive engineering works, a comprehensive plan of countrywide defensive works, including anti-tank positions, machine gun positions, ambush sites, wiring for all of the bridges for demolitions, and defensive positions throughout the beaches. Now, Percival rejected this plan, and he gave no explanation as to why he did that. Although he evidently gave Simpson the ability to approach battalion commanders directly. But of course, there was very little buy-in from that, given the fact that Percival wasn't that interested in the defensive works anyway. And this is one of the big mysteries of the Malaya Campaign, is why there wasn't more defensive works. And as always, it's a complicated story. So firstly, Percival wasn't able to sign off on anything above £500, which is a ridiculously low sum of money back then. Secondly, there was a dramatic shortage of labour. Heath, the commander of the 3rd Indian Corps, he said that he could have used tens of thousands of coolies for the defensive position works. So not only was there a lack of money, there was a lack of labour. And this came about because the Colonial Office... So the interesting thing is that Shenton Thomas, he was the governor of Singapore, didn't actually have a lot of control in Malaya. That was under the Colonial Office. And they refused to pay the wages appropriately for the Indian labourers. And the whole process to get anything actually done was quite laborious. So they would often have to write to 11 separate departments if they wanted work to be done on a national basis in Malaya, because it was all done through a British administration that was controlled by the Colonial Office. And there was a fundamental misunderstanding. The Singaporean and Malayan governments thought that they were preparing for the war that was occurring in Europe. They didn't realise that they were preparing for their own war. And this fed into a fundamental lack of engineering resources and execution for the defensive plan. This is another example, the advantages that naturally accrue to the defender being completely squandered. So not even from a national basis was there the inability to coordinate a defensive engineering plan, but it even happened at divisional level. And there are multiple examples of the stores being available but not being brought forward in a timely manner to be able to impede the Japanese advance. Multiple examples of anti-tank obstacles which just weren't used, anti-tank mines that just weren't used. And this enabled a much wider freedom of manoeuvre to the Japanese than would have naturally occurred to them had the engineering defensive stores been used appropriately. Now, why is this? Well, I think it fundamentally comes down to a lack of training and a lack of understanding of the importance of engineering defensive works in this whole concept of combined arms. The engineers have been left out because of the fact that little thinking has been done to countering armoured threats, which is really quite sad, really, because everyone had been preparing for desert warfare. You know, the troops had been deploying into the Middle East, where there was a strong anti-armoured threat. Now, the sad thing about this is that they're deploying into Malaya, which is jungle, where armour is of much less use because of the fact that it's constrained by being on the roads, which means it's so much easier to shape their movement, to block them. But because of a lack of understanding about the use of defensive stores, they weren't able to do that, and they paid the price for that. And the engineers weren't the only ones who suffered from this lack of ability of cooperation for the generation of a combined arms effect. The artillery was also left out, which is really quite interesting because it was a foundation of the British doctrine, the ability to fix and then destroy with artillery. So why was this? Why were they unable to mass fires and destroy the Japanese? So partially they were moving pretty quickly, but the coordination of artillery requires communication, so no comms, no bombs. And in Malaya, they relied on the triumvirate of wireless, wires, and dispatch riders. Now, when you're encircled, a dispatch rider is probably not the best way of going about communication with the rear headquarters. They had significant problems with wireless communications, and the wires were often cut either by Japanese troops or by artillery. So comms was difficult to achieve in the jungle environment. But also we have a lack of fundamental understanding about how artillery is meant to be employed. Within 8th Division, both of the brigades lacked some of their transport, and one artillery regiment had 3-inch mortars, the other had 18-pounders. Some of the battalion commanders struggled with how to employ their artillery. So both Robertson and Galligan were renowned for micromanaging the employment of their artillery. Robertson was not a fan of it at all. And the orders that he gave around the employment of artillery were only of use when they were completely disobeyed, which that's not the kind of situation that you want to be in. Galligan was prone to micromanaging his artillery units, so much so that he was actually specifying where the gun should be placed, often in the incorrect position. So rather than listening to his subject matter experts, he would place the guns, often putting them too far forward, placing them in danger of small arms fire, and running the risk of losing his guns. And firepower was centralised, often at a divisional level, and that meant that troops on the ground were often not able to get the fire support that they required when they needed it. And this lack of comms, it didn't just impede the generation of offensive support, impeded the ability to manoeuvre. Now, the best example of this is the 22nd Indian Brigade. It lost comms with the 8th Indian Brigade, and they were the ones who were guarding a railway bridge that was required for their withdrawal. They lost comms with that brigade, and the divisional commander was killed trying to regain contact. That was Major General Barstow. So he was killed by Japanese small arms fire as he was moving forward to try and find his brigade. The railway bridge was blown, and the 22nd Indian Brigade was effectively left to its own resources in what became behind enemy lines and was virtually decimated because they weren't able to communicate where they were. So we've looked at the inability of the Allies to cooperate between services. We've looked at the issues within the army as well. And we've looked at some of the factors that have led up to the inability to cooperate. Partially a selection and maintenance of an aim that was never going to achieve the strategic outcome that was required. The difficulty in communication within the jungle environment. The difficulty of the services to want to be able to work together. And that, I think, is fundamentally based on the inability to build robust personal relationships between commanders at the highest level. They should have taken responsibility for the communication between the services and driven that. This would have created a much better unity of effort rather than the turbulent environment that was of the Allies' own creation. Now, the Japanese had some of these problems as well. So they did not have an overly harmonious higher command structure. And we've already talked about some of the interpersonal issues that were created there. And there was a lack of cooperation with the Air Force. So probably the biggest example of this was there was no bombing of the causeway. So as the troops right at the end were streaming across the causeway, there was one place for them to get off. It was over the causeway. There was a bridge there that represented a single point of failure for that withdrawal plan, and the Air Force didn't actually interdict the Allies as they were withdrawing, thankfully. There was an overall lack of integration between the IJA and the IJN, the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy. Now, partially this was because of the fact that it was a secondary effort and the aircraft carriers were off at Pearl Harbor, but it was also because of that inter-service rivalry as well. But on the whole, Yamashita, with his offensive action, was able to bring together enough cooperation between the divisions and between the forces to be able to generate the combat power required to capture Malaya in the time that he had available. And I think that is the salient lesson of this, that training, doctrine and morale will overcome a lot of the problems that you'll face in operational environments. And these were things that were fundamentally lacking on the Allied side, and we were able to see that through the outcome of the campaign. The issues that the Allies faced were so problematic that they were often unable to generate even a combined arms effect, let alone a joint effect. And that was what was required for them to be able to defend Malaya.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Suprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.